I'm absolutely delighted to participate in KM Russia this year. I had the great fortune to meet one of your hosts at the International Conference on the Knowledge Economy Conference a couple weeks ago in Cape Town, South Africa. It was clear to me that the work Vadim is doing in the KM space in Russia is pioneering. After great discussion, he invited me to participate virtually in KM Russia this year, and I'm absolutely delighted to do so. I've been asked to share some KM trends in the US, as well as offer some thoughts on co-creation and the future of KM. And I've been asked to do all of this in 10 to 12 minutes, so let's get ready for a gallop through some of the key ideas that folks are discussing. One of the most interesting trends is there seems to be a move away from the term knowledge management. In many ways, this is not a surprising trend. When I was Director of Knowledge Management for the Canadian Department of National Defence, one of the biggest challenges I faced was defending the term KM. Many people believe the term was too businesslike and was just hype from business schools. To stimulate discussion on the issue, I wrote an article titled "Defense KM, Just a Passing Fad." The catalyst for the article was a comment from a very senior officer who very publicly called KM just a passing fad. Part of the argument of the article was that KM was more about doing specific things than the title, more about outcomes than terminology. One of my favorite stories about the terminology issue comes from my time at Defense. At the time, 10 years ago, and I suspect still today, the Department of National Defense was a very siloed organization. Our Air Force operated differently from our Navy, that operated different from our strategic headquarters. Our KM team was responsible for coordinating, but not directing KM efforts across the organization. But we had some parts that were much more supportive and some parts that really didn't have much time for KM. Our Air Force was probably in the latter group. They did not believe in KM, or perhaps more accurately, they were less supportive of initiatives that included the term KM. Part of our challenge was finding ways to convert the naysayers into believers. Here's an example. As I mentioned, the term KM, or knowledge management, was certainly not part of the Air Force's lexicon. They did not like the term and they simply would not use it. Our KM team discovered that although they did not use the term, the Air Force was very good at KM. How could that be? The Air Force has a monthly magazine called Flight Comment. In this magazine, flight crews would be very honest in the stories they would share about what they call near misses. In other words, if a pilot, engineer, or avionics technician did something that endangered an aircraft and its crew, they would tell the story in the hopes that others would not make the same mistake. To us, this was the epitome of KM in action. These people were willing to share their stories that usually involved them breaking a rule, taking a shortcut, or not paying attention, and they did all of this to prevent future incidents. If that's not KM, then I don't know what is. However, the Flight Comment magazine never used the word KM. The point is the practices were much, much more important than the term. To us, the Air Force was an example of KM in action. So let's return to this issue of the declining use of KM, or knowledge management, as a term. Google offers two interesting tools to see what is trending. The first is called Ngram and shows the percentage usage of a given term in Google Books. The data is only available to 2008, but it's useful nevertheless. So here's the Ngram for information management showing the term years 1960 to 2008. You can see a steady increase through the mid-1990s and then it plateaued. If we add the term knowledge management, shown in red, to the Ngram, we can see that KM took off about the same time as information management plateaued, and then it plateaued about a decade later. This is about the same time I wrote the article I mentioned. Remember, these graphs are based on the books found in Google Books between 1990 and 2008. Another useful tool is the Google Trend tool, which shows the number of Google searches for a particular word or phrase. Here is the graph for the term information management searches from 2004 to 2013, and we can see a steady decline in the early 2000s, and then it's pretty flat. If we add the term knowledge management, the slide looks like this. The key thing to note is that Google searches for KM have declined since 2004, much as information management. Remember, this slide is US data. We could widen the search to worldwide data and see similar results. Now for fun, let's add another term that people think is gaining popularity, big data. Here is the graph for big data shown in yellow, along with information management in blue and knowledge management in red. As you can see, there's been a tremendous increase in searches for big data in the last couple of years. Big data is growing in the popular press. There has been an increase in the subject for the last couple of years. Funny enough, many of us in the KM world have been talking about this issue for some time. I've been talking about the subject for over a decade, often to audiences who seem not very interested. In 2007, I wrote an article titled Diapers, Pop-Tarts, and Dog Food for Prairie Business Magazine. Suddenly it's become by far the most popular and downloaded article I ever wrote about data mining and big data, but it was written 5 years ago. However, the recent big data cover story in Foreign Affairs magazine has elevated the discussion to a new level. Executives around the world are trying to see how they can learn and create a competitive advantage from the vast data collections. This slide provides a brief glimpse into the data we are creating every minute. I'm sure you've seen many like this. But for example, this slide shows we create 48 hours of YouTube videos every minute. Twitter users send over 100,000 tweets every minute. Presumably some of you are tweeting right now. There's something like 200 million emails sent every minute. And there are many, many more examples to illustrate how much data is being collected, and perhaps our task is to figure out how to mine it. So if there's a single big item attracting a lot of attention in the KM domain, I think it must be big data. Now let's turn to the issue of co-creation. I'd like to share an idea that is specifically designed to create an environment in which various stakeholders can collectively create and exploit knowledge. The technique is called strategic wargaming, and although this is common practice in militaries around the world, it's not used as much in civilian organizations as I think it should be. Perhaps the best way to illustrate the power of this technique is to ask you a few questions. How do you test your plans before you execute them? How do you test your decision support structures? How do you put your plan under realistic stress before execution? Who plays the role of adversary, your competition, or your clients? Well, many organizations have great difficulty answering these questions, and that is where wargaming can help. In most militaries, every course of action is wargamed before committing to a preferred strategy or plan. Militaries rehearse by wargaming any and all commanders who have to make decisions in the execution or synchronization of the plan. They rehearse by wargaming the actions of a realistic adversary in a realistic operational environment. The wargame is a cooperative leadership and learning environment because they believe that sweat and tears in a wargame are preferable to blood and tears on the battlefield. So what is the equivalent of blood, sweat, and tears on your corporate battlefield? We argue that wargame hindsight becomes business foresight. What is wargaming? Wargames are real-time action-reaction role-playing workshops that pit your key real-life decision makers and managers, which we call the blue team, against real-time competitive adversaries, which we call red team, and disciplined by an executive-level white team, or consider them umpires. Wargaming is a discipline to test your plan that is designed to promote risk mitigation, innovation, mechanisms of discovery for leadership, mechanisms of voice for your teams, and real-time operational learning for all. The most important element of wargaming is not the tool used, but the people who participate, hence the link to co-creation. The first type of wargame is called a course of action wargame. These are a series of 2 or more sequential and comparable wargames involving the same conditions, actors, and weighting criteria to determine the most viable options available in terms of risk, execution, payoff, etc. This is a decision support tool for senior executives to recommend a distinct plan of action to corporate leadership. Red and blue players are normally drawn from the extant pool of executives normally involved in your company's strategic and operational planning processes. The second type is called the rehearsal wargame, which is a comprehensive exercise to test a single accepted plan prior to execution. The blue team involves all senior executives who must make decisions and manage activities in the execution of that plan and confined to the accepted decision support roles. The red team is drawn from corporate leadership team and subject matter experts. The third type is called the red team exercise. This is similar to a rehearsal war game, with the exception that none of the red team players are drawn from the company's decision support stakeholders. Each red team player is an outside subject matter expert and is not a company stakeholder and is only given to a reasonable amount of information that a normal competitor would have access to. The red team's role is not merely to test the plan as adversarial players, but rather to put it under extreme competitive stress. In summary, war games are about evaluating courses of action to recommend a distinct plan, leveraging rehearsals as a comprehensive exercise under conditions of extreme competitive stress to test critical plans. The red team's role is not merely to test the plan as adversarial players, but rather to put it under extreme competitive stress. Reinforcing unity of thought, purpose, and action throughout your team. Visualizing the flow of operations, giving joint strengths, weaknesses, dispositions, capabilities, and courses of actions available to business actors in a given business sector and environment. Well, that's a very brief overview of wargaming, but I hope you agree how that can be a key factor in co-creation. So here's some food for thought as I close. Dancers rehearse, actors rehearse, militaries rehearse. Shouldn't you? Well, thanks very much for allowing me to share some ideas with you today about the trends and co-creation. I wish you the best for the remainder of KM Russia, and I hope to see you next year. Thanks so much.